and a few others that came and specifically focused on the university environment. And then people like Dr. Muhammad Mufattah, Beheshti, Marhum Mutahari, and a few others that had the Hawza background and moved into this field, particularly the academic environment, both Mufattah and Marhum Mutahari, that had two hats. On the one hand, they were theologian, on the other hand, they were more of academic because of their position, teaching at the university. Ali Shariati is one of these people that began giving lectures. Strangely enough, during 1974, 75, 76, and even late 1976, they used to go to the same masjid, most of them, Husseiniya Irshad in North Tehran. Marhum Mutahari would give a lecture, Ali Shariati would give a lecture, sometimes Mahdi Bazargan gives a lecture, etc. in the same. Husseiniya Irshad became the symbol of what we call pragmatic, more liberally, intellectually oriented youth. Ali Shariati's difference with the others was his command of what we call poetic language, and mixed with sociological kind of phrases that he had studied outside. Otherwise, from a religious point of view, Ali Shariati would not be considered as a religious scholar, as a basic teaching or studying with his father, a little bit of tafsir, because his father has a book on tafsir Quran, and a little bit of what we call Arabic literature, etc., etc. Beyond that, he has not studied much. So he's not familiar with Islamic philosophy, he's not familiar with the history of Islam per se, he's not familiar with kalam, he's not familiar with theology, etc., etc. But he became famous because of that poetic language. The theme that he's trying to present in this paper or booklet is that, and I've read it, and I've read the critique of a number of other people on his presentation. I'm going to ask you. The theme is that, technically speaking, there are two types of Shias. What he calls Shia Alawi, or Red Shia, sometimes being defined as Red Shia. And the second category or class is Shia Safawi, or Black Shia. From a post-colonial discourse or lens, even the use of black to indicate negativity could be critiqued by itself. And I'm surprised for a person who claims to have met Fanon, Aimé Césaire, and Sartre, and a number of others, that they are prominent figures within post-colonial discourse. How comes that when it comes to the usage of this language, he's not more careful in not bringing this kind of language into the discourse, whether here or there? He's trying to, the thesis is that somehow an unholy shift took place. The Shia, the Red Shia that existed during the early time and history of Islam, became Black Shia, or the Shia Alawi that followed the Imam Ali's role model, became Shia Safawi that followed the Safavites' role model, or more active and more passive Shias, from the moment that the Safawis came to power and converted Iran into Shias. Particularly their background being mystical, etc., etc., Sufis. This is the thesis that he's going to present. Now, who's going to take it? This is the thesis. What sort of supporting argument he submits to support his position, what kind of critiques does he have, etc., etc. Adam Hussein.
One of the things, I know that at the end of the articles, when he made his main point, he said the thesis that he says that things have changed. It's not the status quo has changed. But one of the things that he...
The same thing, by the way, happened with Sashadina. after writing a book about the fact that the 12th Imam, the hidden Imam, was a Shia construct that didn't exist at the beginning,
Right.
when he was subjected to criticism and facts against his assessment, he said, my views have changed, and it's neither here nor there. But let's focus what he says here.
One of the things he says that I paid attention to for thesis and weakness, even though I think most of it is a strength, and it reminded me of, in general, your presentations during Muharram, during Ashura, the answer to the downtrodden people to retain or attain respect, dignity, and fairness, or sometimes he uses equality and more, Western words, is through the type of Shia Islam, this red Shi'ism, practiced up until the more recent times, so before the Safawites. Now, in all fairness, the beginning half of the document, I think he presents Islam in general in a good way, and Shi'ism in a good way. He says it's not only about the physical revolution, but it's a revolution in ideas also, and action. So not only in general the fight or removing oppression by violence. But my main problem, and this confused the rest of the document for me, I thought maybe I could reconcile it, but it was contradictory. The example that he used at the end or towards the middle, and it's pretty much the only example that he used in the whole document, was the main example, when he talks about a nephew of the rulers enter the village of Bashtin. So he's talking about after, I think, I'm not sure his name, Hajj Khalifa or Sheikh Khalifa was his name, was killed. And he speaks about the villagers, and he says himself that they were Shia. And he doesn't say that they were red Shia, but pretty much in the context of what he's saying, he says that, of course, they eventually revolted. My problem with the document was, I said to myself, reading this, does this document prepare people? Let's say you have the farmers, you have the rural people, they're oppressed. And you say, well, here's something called Shia Islam, take it and run with it and overrun your oppressors. Well, then you become the leader after that. What do you do? If you're not prepared to have the morality of a Shia once you're the ruler, what's the value of the rule that you have? Now, I say that because in this example, when do they revolt? When the person comes to their town? No. When the person asks for wine, the Shia give it to them. Only when their ego is hit and even hardened says, we want your women. But these people aren't ready to lead, and it was a very bad example. I think he should have stuck with the example of Imam Hussein if there's no other example to use. He used an example of people who didn't have the morality. So okay, they take over. But the people like that are not ready to lead, not as Shia. Those aren't red Shia if that's the case. Because if those are people who compromise, like he's criticizing those who are the people of compromise, those are people of compromise. When things get difficult for them down the road one day, if they were so willing to give someone alcohol, they'll be willing to make other exceptions. So I think that it was a terrible example and confused the document for me. Hopefully I'm wrong and you can clarify this, dear Sheikh.
What is his definition, or how does he define, say, pragmatic red Shias, or more liberating red Shias from the black Shias? To follow his... What is the criteria that if you were to follow this criteria, then you fall into this category, or the absence of it would become a different category?
Well, the issue is he never really went into virtually any depth regarding the black Shias, and so it's really left up to our speculation. Especially near the end is when he really kind of gives us a clear idea as to what he's trying to imply. But even still, that's like iffy. And so
I think there is enough within the text to give you an indication of what he's looking for. Remember that he is the byproduct of a unique time in Iran, in which the society is searching for the Messiah, somebody to lead them out of the misery, and primarily what concerns them is social justice. during even the period that he lives in France, primarily he deals with figures. He doesn't deal with Henry Corbin, for example, the leading figure of Shia and Islamic theology and philosophy in the West, in France, that was teaching in Sorbonne when he was a student. Instead, he goes with Sartre, Frank Fanon, and Aimé Césaire and others, the leading figures in post-colonial discourse. And it is during the time in which Algerians are rising for the freedom of their countries. A number of colonial countries are rising. So this is his blinkers, that he looks at things through that angle. But social justice becomes an issue. Red Shi'ism, Shi'ism of Alawi descent and so on, is a Shi'ism that never tolerates injustice and always is ready to give whatever they have, even their lives, to stand up to injustice and support justice. Where Shahada and martyrdom is ingrained in because if you read his book on Shahada, for example, Imam Hussein, salawatullah salam alayhi, that he says Imam Hussein taught us something, that you either live by the values of Ali or you die the way Imam Hussein died. So these are the two values. You either stand and defend, or if you cannot do anything, then you die for it. So social justice is a classic example. I mean, the main criteria by which he defines or classifies one Shia, differentiates one Shia from the other. Well, if that's the case, what does he have to support? You posit an idea. You say that there are Shias, they were all Alawi from the beginning of the history until Safawi came and took things around and changed things around. And it became from an active Alawi into a passive Safawi, that they put up with the injustices or corruption of the rulers, etc., etc. Can this thesis be supported? Even without looking at Shia, can we really, the same kind of, similar kind of argument exists in the Western academia regarding the war of religions, that in which they designated 130 years in the history of Europe as this was a war in which purely religion dictated all the violence. When you assess it, it's far from the truth. So there are a number of factors. If we look at the history of Islam, or history of Shi'ism, we see that even during the life of our Imams, what he considers to be the black Shi'ism or Safawi Shi'ism existed. Who killed Imam Hussein? We have, as I indicated during the 10 nights, we certainly have no historical documents that any army or troops came from outside Kufa to battle or fight with Imam Hussein. So the consequence is the Shias of Kufa, who had seen Ali, who had seen Imam Hassan and so on, somehow were neutralized by the love of material. That's exactly what he calls Shia Safawi, who did not support Zayd ibn Ali, the founder of the Zaydiyya movement, and his brother that were killed. Why Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq salawatullah salam alayhi say no revolt is going to succeed? Because people don't have commitment. So the notion that somehow historically there is a period in which you can classify the Shias or put them or categorize them as monolithic entity is far from the truth, cannot be supported. One of the fundamental challenge or critique that we have against Dr. Shariati is lack of support and evidence to support his argument. Nothing is there. He simply posits a thesis and then uses poetic language to just turn around it, and that's it. What is there to support it as an academic discussion? That's number one. So we cannot support the main thesis of the book. It's a mere claim. Even examples that he gives occasionally, like the one Brother Hussein cited,
It seems that was like the only example, actually.
it's just not a credible example that one could build a thesis or support a thesis based on it, because you can argue one way or the other. Was it when they became Shias because they were utilitarianly organized, or was it no, there is fundamental belief, etc., etc.? There is a fundamental problem. Can you turn people from one faith, one school of theology, into completely opposite by force?
He tried proving that with the example of the Mongols. He said they used force to change people's faiths.
One, they were absorbed into the same faith and they had to change their own faith.
That's true.
Yeah.
We have certainly before that, in the case of Spain, where the Christians came in and forced people, Muslims and Jews, to convert to Christianity. It didn't succeed. It took a long period of time, probably up to 1600, about the year 17th century, from 13th century until finally this took place. The notion that Safawis were able to suddenly create a transformation within the Muslim, within the Iranian kind of milieu, to take them from Sunni understanding. Remember, Iran was the base of Sunnism. Most of the scholars that Sunnis have came out of Iran. Bukhari is from Iran, Muhammad Muslim from Iran, a number of other scholars, Sunni scholars are from Iran. So the notion that Islam, Sunni school of theology, being ingrained in a society, bunch of mystics come in and overnight you turn this around. If there is no foundation, the coexistence of those two interpretations over there.
That's a far-fetched notion at that point. Even like if they were, even if that were true, let's suppose that the mystics were able to change it overnight, but that would mean that the Sunni structure in Iran at that time was so weak and flamboyant that like the second they came,
That's it, you can turn them around.
Yeah.
And plus, he indicates that by force, we have no indication, no support in history that Safawis used force to call people to convert them. You just mystical khanaqah. These places were organized and people simply turned around. The same idea is being presented with regard to the fall of Sassanid dynasty under the banner of in front of Islam. The people were killed, slaughtered, and bloodbath. We have no documentary evidence for it. This is where my thesis during Muharram was, when we talked about the role of imams, how they went around, in which once they realized that the current bunch of Muslims that we have are useless, you really need to establish a new nucleus. And the first nucleus that was, until the older ones reformed themselves, you really need to create the nucleus. The first step towards the creation of that nucleus was Imam Zainul Abidin sallallahu alayhi, and sending of around of what 1,000 slaves that he purchased, freed, taught, and sent them around. Then the second level came the academic approach or phase, in which Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq sent their representative around. For what purpose? To create this nucleus over there. So from, say, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, which was around 100 after Hijrah, around, say, middle of 8th century, to 16th century, which was the Safawis that came to power, 8th century, nothing took place. While we see Qom becoming a center of Shi'ism, Ray near Tehran became a center of Shi'ism, Isfahan became a center of Shi'ism, Shiraz became a center of Shi'ism, Nayshabur became a center of Shi'ism, where he was born. Mashhad, Khurasan, Tus became a center of Shi'ism. Qazvin is the center of Shia spread around. Bukhara had its own cases. So the notion that nobody did anything about the creation, all this activity was, as he will have to accept by our imams and religious scholars to create the Alawite Shias, which means what? The Safawite Shia by default existed at the time. If they were there, you didn't need to create them. This simplistic approach to the construction of history in periodic history, that from this period to that period is the barbaric age, from this period to this period is the infancy of humanity, from this period to that period is the early stages of religiosity, and then from this period to that period comes the enlightenment and maturity. This is something that the West has been famous for in their classification of religion and other. Weber, go on and see Durkheim and Weber, two classic so-called theorists about this is linear division of history. And one of the things that now in the post-colonial discourse, as well as the comparative theology at universities and academic establishments, they challenge this simplistic approach or an analysis of history of humanity. We don't have such a thing as 1,000 years people simply lived in barbaric stage. It's fiction. No wonder J.C. Smith, the theologian who taught theology and religion and religious studies at Chicago, said this kind of religion only exists in academic establishment. It has no reality outside. You construct some definition and then you build on it to protect your own seat within the university. And you start writing. The sacred and the profane. Real. It has no reality outside. But thank you very much. It was very fruitful classification or distinction given. He became well known. And even up to today, most of the theological studies, they're still teaching and reading his books. So the first critique against him is that the thesis is oversimplistic when it comes to division of Muslim history or Shia history between one phase, because we can bring in an ample proof to counter this notion that at the beginning it was Alawi Shias and then they became Safavi Shias.
The whole notion, like, when I was reading it, I kind of got the sense that, like, I really just heard kind of communism coming out of it, in a sense with their sense of revolutions happening kind of overnight, those kind of rapid changes. Reading it, I kind of got that same notion. Like, I know that's not what he was going for, but like this sense that the Red Shias are like this kind of revolutionary force going back to the
which is the byproduct of what the life that he had in France with the Algerian revolutionaries and post-colonial writers like Aimé Césaire, Frank Fanon, and who else? The other one that came from Tunis, and a few others. And Sartre in particular, the guiding figure here was Sartre. So these are, and the names that he mentioned, dropping names. These are, most of them are sociologists in France, so-called revolutionary sociologists in France. But there is nothing in the document to support it from solid religious, Shia sources. That's one of his greatest shortcoming of his work, is that he's never been able to support his argument one way or the other with solid, and that is because of his background, that when it comes to theology, religion, Shia history, kalam, and philosophy, he doesn't have anything. The greatest, you can see why you understand the depth of the shortcoming by the critique of those what we have as established figures in Shia, in contemporary Shia philosophy, theology, and so on. Mutahari presented at the same Hosseini Irshad. He has a number of books literally on the lectures that he presented in Hosseini Irshad. Look at his scathing attack against Shariati.
Where is this attack?
Yeah, I mean, it's
In
in
the-
in Marhum Mutahari's books, as well as on his site. Mutahari and Shariati. If you go and search it, you see it. He comes down, he says, this is not Islam. The claim, particularly his Shariati has a book about Islam Shanasi, which means how to know Islam or understanding Islam. This is critique not by Marhum Mutahari, by a number of other scholars, including Allama Tabatabai. And these are two major figures within our own contemporary life. If you want to understand Islam, what about the books authored by other scholars that have much more in-depth? They may not be theologian in the narrative sense, in the narrow sense, but they have had at least worked with the historian Hussein Nasr. Read his book Shi'ite Islam, which is a translation of a book that Marhum Tabatabai wrote about the essence of Shia and history, and Marhum Sadr's book, At-Tashayyu' fil Islam. So there are a number of other books that we have by solid scholars that when you read them, you will find out that this is nothing but fiction or one's imagination. So this is number two. Number three, it is his book that now all the Wahhabis and so on, they keep using against the Shia. These are Safawite, supporting the Orientalist approach or understanding or thesis that Shia really was a fringe constructed over time, it didn't exist, which feeds into what Sunnis are trying to present.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say, can Red Shi'ism be translated into modern day Wahhabi mindset?
No, he says revolutionaries. These are people that stand up to injustice. That's Red Shia. But his thesis or claim that what we have Shia today as people, as a Safawite Shia, which is a passive black and so on Shias, these are not only cannot be supported, is being used by people like Wahhabis and others. That the arc of Safawite Shias that are going to come to control the Middle East. The Safawite Shias are doing this. The Safawite is doing this, which uses that old narrative that Shia really has no history. And this again is contradicted. The notion that Shia has no history. These people, they misuse the terminology. He doesn't want to say that Shia has no history. He says that the earlier one was much more pragmatic, liberated, etc., etc. Then it became kind of passive in cahoot with the powers. But these people today, they jump on the second part, forgetting about the first part. Constantly in the political language of vernacular of what we call the Sunnis and the Wahhabis, constantly Safawite. Shia, if we really want to pay attention to, has had much richer history than anybody else within Islam. Sunnis began to develop their own theology and so on 100 and some years after the demise of the Holy Prophet. We had access to Wahy directly, but transmitted through Ahlul Bayt, which makes us in much stronger position than the Sunnis. So for somebody to say simplistically this period was Shia Alawi, everybody rose. If all the Shias of the time rose against injustice during that early part, we wouldn't have been in the position. The Sunnis would not have had the position, or Amawis would not have to rule, anybody else would not have. The fact that they capitulated and they literally put up with the status quo, which is exactly what he wants to use as a classification to call Shia Safawi. What I strongly recommend, now that you have read this, read Shi'ite Islam. It's a book, small booklet, about some, I don't know, many pages. It's the author is Marhum Allama Tabatabai, but the translate is an excellent translation. PDF file exists on internet. You don't need to buy the book. Read it. An excellent translation with Dr. Nasser, Hussein Nasser. And you see the difference. Now, somebody is talking about the history of Islam, particularly the introduction, about the history of Shi'ism from a perspective that now has an authority in it, not like him. For an opinion to be of any worth, the authority of the person who posits that opinion is critical. Otherwise, in your business, in your studies, if your opinion of the authority is equally valid to the opinion of has no authority, it doesn't mean much. Simply because I stand in the mosque and deliver, or Husseini Irshad, and deliver a sermon that linguistically is poetic, doesn't mean that when it comes to substance, it contains much. I mean, no disrespect to Muhammad Ali Shariati, Dr. Shariati himself. I've seen him in Tehran in 1975-76 when I was studying there. But I had seen Marhum Mutari as well, and I've seen others. But once you have your own, establish a foundation for yourself, then you immediately, once somebody begins to unpack the proposition that they have, begin to understand where the shortcoming is. Any question? Go ahead, Brother Hussein.
If I'm not mistaken, this document is from 1972. So I imagine, I don't remember which year Shaykh Mutahari was killed.
78.
Okay, so I'm assuming
78,
this is
79.
around the time where Shaykh Mutahari is speaking.
Yes.
And Khomeini is still out of the country.
Yes,
not speaking. It says, Ashura reminds us of the teaching of the eternal fact that the present version of Islam is a criminal Islam.
Yeah.
Who's he talking about? Because the youth would have gotten confused.
That's another critique, that once you define Shi'ism after Safavid as totally passive, what about the role of these scholars that stood up to tyrannies and so on, individually or collectively? What's there? Allama Nouri, Fazlullah Nouri, gave his life in support of what we call a unique form of democracy that protects religion as well. Hassan Mudarris, we talk about the Iranian context. In Iraq, Muhammad Taqi Shirazi, Sheikh Muhammad Taqi Shirazi, rose against the British. Others that stood up against Khalisi, and others that stood up and challenged the tyrannies. What happened to them? If by one brush, literally from 1500, beginning of the 16th century, everything that happens becomes Safavid.
You discredit everybody.
Yes, yeah. The role of Marhum Imam, the whole 15th of Khordad, the uprising against tyranny, etc., disappears. The mere citing of few. Yes, Shia unfortunately has had this dichotomy of different leaders that fall into different categories of what we call dynamic and passive, right from the beginning. The beginning of the occultation, we have had these two parallel interpretations of the role of scholars in the life of community, right from there. But because after Safavid came, Safavids succeeded in turning Iran around from a center of Sunni Islam into Shia Islam because of the hard work of scholars from centuries before. Not it's something that overnight.
Yeah, it's not like the Sunni establishment in Iran was so weak and fragile that
No,
it just
they were
changed
strong.
overnight. Yeah,
But it was the presence of these cells, intellectual cells, philosophy, kalam, theology, that presented Ahlul Bayt in the dynamic, what you call Shia Alawi understanding of it. That when the Safavid, literally the apple is ready to fall, you pick it up. Problem is, it fell on Newton's head, and he understood where the idea is from, falls on some people's head and don't recognize it. There is nothing in the history of humanity that suddenly a quantum leap takes place. Something will happen 180-degree overnight, unless you go through bloodbath. So use your academic and intellectual tools to critique these. Doesn't matter. There is a hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says, "لا تنظر إلى من قال, انظر إلى ما قال." Don't look at who's saying something. Look at what is being said. What does that mean? Be critical thinker. I really care less whether it's Marhum Mutahari, rahmatullah alayh, or Dr. Ali Shariati, or Mufattih, or Beheshti, or anybody else. I'm not looking at the figure. What is being presented. Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq salawatullah salam alayhi says the same thing. He says, when our ahadith are presented to you, presented to Quran and human intellect, if it makes sense, accept it, otherwise throw it against the wall. Which means true Shia is a critical thinker. It just doesn't make sense for you to chop half of life of Shia from around 7th, 8th century to 16th century as desirable, and then suddenly undesirable because there are some elements existing in the Iranian community of the time that they collaborated with the tyranny. In every society we have had this shit. Sunnis as well as Shias.
Usually,
In every society, even other faith, we have to do the same thing.
when you introduce that kind of language about like we have this desirable time, we're living in an undesirable time.
It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense.
It usually does not end.
Yeah, two ideas work parallel. Depends where you position yourself. He had seen few scholars, well, let's call them turban wearers, not scholars, during the Shah's regime that supported the Shah. So what? Before it, we had others that supported previous time. During even our Imams, not everybody supported our Imams. Zaydis, the beginning of the Zaydi movement, was contrary to the position of our Imams. Imam said they are not going to succeed. They said, no, we are going to. So this notion of Alawi, Safawi kind is an artificial construct that might be a good thing for academic environment or giving lectures and oratory, etc., and poetic language, but on paper, there is nothing to support it. Like every other thesis that he presents, he does not support. Again, within Islam, Shinasi, Bazgasht, return to self, which is, again, he picks it up from one or two of the French philosophers. Nothing constructively to support beyond certain ideas as what we call early stages of post-colonial discourse. So you not only really need to read the major figures of early figures of post-colonialism, particularly during 1960s, where he was there, to understand where he comes from. Sartre in particular, understanding existentialism of Sartre, etc. Read it and see how in tune he is. If you want to really understand, let's assume that you had no access to Islam and Shia and so on in Iran. Henry Corbin was in France at the time teaching about Shia Islam. Why didn't you attend these lectures? But you went to Sartre.
Those would have been some very interesting lectures.
Yes. And this is a major figure. He's an Orientalist, but somebody who understands the depth of Shia philosophy, Kalam, theology, and so on. Comes and spends many years with Allama Tabatabai. So there's a Nasr as the interpreter between them. So he has a tendency, there is a movement within Iranians, and it affected others, that the intellectuals are the only one that have the right to interpret the faith the way they want. And who are the intellectuals? According to him, these are people that are familiar with the Western ideas and Western narratives. including himself and few others. Otherwise, if you have no understanding of that narrative or language, then you are not the intellectual.
Even if you spent your life
Even
being a
if
scholar.
even if you are the most scholar. Allama Tabatabai was at the time available in Iran. He never attended one of his lectures. He never sat in conversation with Marhum Mutari or anybody else. So it's unfortunately in his case that, but because he was there at the right time, when the youth within the Iranian community were beginning to rise up and search for the sacred link that connects them with the divine, and he was there. That to a degree he made a contribution. But once he moved into what I call more detailed, in-depth understanding of things, it was out of his field. So what's next?